On the first day of battle at Thermopylae in 480 BC, the narrow pass became a trap for the size of Xerxes' army. Median troops and other Persian contingents moved toward the Greek position, but only a limited number could fight at one time. Ahead of them stood the allied defenders commanded by Leonidas. Greek hoplites formed deep ranks behind large round shields. Long spears projected from the front, while an old defensive wall strengthened part of the position. Mountains rose on one side, and the ancient shoreline pressed close on the other, reducing the battlefield to a confined corridor. Xerxes possessed far greater numbers, yet repeated assaults failed to create a decisive opening. When the first attackers could not break the line, Xerxes committed the force Herodotus describes as the finest Persian infantry in his army. 10,000 selected Persians advanced under Hydarnes. Greek tradition would remember them as the Immortals. They were expected to succeed where the earlier troops had failed. According to Herodotus, their numbers were always maintained at 10,000, with a replacement entering whenever one man died, became ill, or left the ranks. They were associated with the king, enjoyed high status, and represented the most distinguished Persian infantry in the invasion force. But reputation could not change the ground before them. The Immortals entered the pass and met the same narrow frontage. They could not use their full numbers, move around the Greek flanks, or combine freely with cavalry. Their shorter spears placed them at a disadvantage against the longer weapons of the hoplites, while the Greek shield wall remained difficult to penetrate from the front. Herodotus also describes the Spartans using controlled withdrawals. Greek troops appeared to retreat, encouraging Persian soldiers to pursue. Then the hoplites turned, restored their formation, and attacked opponents who had lost part of their order. The Immortals were not stopped because they lacked discipline or courage. They were forced to fight in conditions that favored heavy Greek infantry and denied the Persian army many of its usual advantages. Xerxes therefore needed another solution. A local man named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path leading behind the Greek position. The force assigned to follow it was Hydarnes and his selected Persians. The soldiers who could not break Thermopylae through a frontal assault were now ordered to march through darkness, maintain discipline on unfamiliar ground, bypass the guards above the pass, and appear behind Leonidas at the decisive moment. Their strength would emerge not in collision but through movement and surprise. Who were these 10,000 Immortals, and why did Persia's most famous elite infantry fail at the Greek wall, yet become the force that made the wall impossible to defend? The Achaemenid Empire under Xerxes ruled a diverse territory. Its authority extended across Iran, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, Central Asia, and parts of the Indus Valley. An army drawn from such a realm could not look, speak, or fight in one uniform way. Persian forces marched beside Medes, Bactrians, Saka, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Babylonians, Anatolian peoples, and many other subjects of the empire. This diversity gave Xerxes access to great manpower, specialized skills, ships, cavalry, archers, and regional knowledge. But it also created problems of communication, supply, and command. Different contingents used different languages, weapons, clothing, and military traditions. Their leaders had to cooperate inside a single campaign while still answering through the imperial chain of authority. Popular images often reduced Xerxes' army to a disorganized mass, driven forward by fear and numbers. That view ignores the planning required to move a large force across Anatolia, bridge the Hellespont, support it along the coast, and carry it deep into Greece. Roads had to be prepared. Supply depots had to be stocked. Water sources had to be identified. Transport animals, ships, engineers, interpreters, and regional commanders all had to function together. An empire could not conduct such a campaign if it possessed no organization. Yet the scale and diversity of the army made a reliable force near the king especially valuable. Xerxes needed soldiers who could remain close to him throughout the march, guard the royal camp, react quickly during emergencies, carry out special assignments, and serve as a reserve that could be trusted when other units failed. Such a force also represented the power of the imperial center. Wherever the king traveled, these troops made his authority visible. The unit Herodotus calls the Immortals appears to have fulfilled several of these roles. They were elite Persian infantry, closely associated with the king and placed among the most distinguished soldiers in the invasion force. They could fight on the battlefield, protect the royal position, and undertake missions requiring discipline and dependable command. However, the surviving evidence remains limited. We cannot prove that their exact duties were identical in every period, or that every member always acted as a bodyguard. Much of the detailed picture depends on Herodotus, a Greek writer describing the enemy after the wars. According to his account, the unit received its famous name because its strength was always maintained at exactly 10,000 men. Whenever one soldier died, became ill, or could no longer serve, another immediately replaced him. To outside observers, the formation therefore seemed never to decrease. The name did not mean that individual soldiers believed themselves unable to die. It described continuity, not supernatural survival. The corps remained complete even as its members changed. Still, this explanation must be treated cautiously. No surviving Persian administrative record fully confirms the replacement system exactly as Herodotus describes it. Immortals is also a Greek name, and the official Old Persian title of the unit remains uncertain. Herodotus emphasizes their high status through descriptions of gold ornaments, personal attendants, baggage wagons, and specially organized supplies. These privileges were not simply luxuries. They showed that the unit stood near the center of imperial power, received logistical support, and embodied the wealth of the king. The Immortals were therefore more than 10,000 famous warriors. They were a symbol of continuity, a reliable military reserve, and a visible expression of royal authority inside a vast multinational army. But reputation, gold, and proximity to Xerxes do not explain how they actually fought. To understand that, we must examine their organization, weapons, armor, mobility, and the limitations of Persian infantry in close combat. The force remembered as the Persian Immortals is known mainly through Herodotus. He uses the Greek word athanatoi, meaning the Immortals, but we do not know what the Persians called the corps. The name may have been a Greek translation of a Persian title, an interpretation of a military term, or a description inspired by the claim that the unit always remained at full strength. Because direct Persian evidence is limited, the title should be treated as a Greek label rather than a securely identified Old Persian name. Herodotus calls the Immortals selected Persians. Membership may have favored experienced warriors, men from respected families, or soldiers connected to the royal court. Loyalty, physical ability, and discipline were important, yet no complete recruitment regulation survives. We cannot reconstruct a secret academy, a unique initiation ritual, or a precise entrance test without inventing evidence. The documentary should present them as selected Persian soldiers while acknowledging that the exact route into the unit remains uncertain. During Xerxes' invasion of Greece, the Immortals were commanded by Hydarnes. He came from a Persian family, and his father had been associated with the political struggles that brought Darius to power. Hydarnes therefore represented military authority and aristocratic connection. Achaemenid armies appear to have used decimal organization, with formations arranged in groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and larger bodies. The 10,000 Immortals were probably divided into smaller commands for marching and battlefield control. Their famous number likely described the nominal strength of the entire corps, not one undivided block moving without internal officers. Their appearance should not be reconstructed through modern fantasy. Herodotus describes Persian infantry wearing soft felt caps, long-sleeved garments, trousers, and clothing suited to Iranian traditions. Some passages suggest colorful or patterned textiles, while others have been interpreted as referring to protection with a scale-like appearance. Reliefs at Persepolis show Persian and Median figures with carefully arranged hair and beards, long garments, spears, bows, and shields. These images are useful for understanding elite court culture, but they cannot automatically be labeled as portraits of the Immortals. They represent the imperial world, not a documented picture of one regiment. Persian infantry often carried shields made from woven materials, sometimes described as wicker, cane, or willow. These shields were light, easy to transport, and useful for forming a protective screen for archers. They suited an army that valued mobility, missile fire, and cooperation between troop types. However, they did not provide the same mass as the large hoplon carried by a Greek hoplite. In a direct collision between dense infantry lines, the heavier Greek shield better absorbed impact and supported collective pressure. The Persian shield was not primitive, it was designed for another method of fighting. The bow was central to Persian warfare. Immortal troops could fire from behind shield barriers, weaken an enemy before close contact, pressure exposed men and animals, and force opponents to keep their shields raised. A single arrow did not need to penetrate the strongest armor to matter. Large volumes of fire could wound unprotected areas, exhaust troops, disturb movement, and create opportunities for cavalry or advancing infantry. Missile pressure worked best when the Persians possessed space, time, and support. Herodotus also describes Persian soldiers carrying relatively short spears, short swords or daggers, bows, and quivers. On open ground, this combination allowed flexible movement. Infantry could shoot, advance, withdraw, cooperate with cavalry, or threaten an enemy from several directions. At Thermopylae, the same equipment became less effective because the battlefield forced them into a frontal struggle. Their shorter spears placed them at a disadvantage against the longer thrusting spears of the hoplites. Before reaching the Greek shield wall, Persian soldiers first had to pass the points extending beyond it. Swords became useful only after closing the distance. Armor remains another area of uncertainty. The evidence does not support the image of every immortal wearing identical metal protection from head to foot. Some may have used scale armor, layered fabric, shields, and soft headgear rather than heavy bronze helmets. Equipment may have varied according to rank, wealth, assignment, and period. Lighter protection offered advantages. It improved endurance and mobility, helped soldiers respond quickly, and suited operations requiring speed. Heavy hoplite equipment provided greater protection in close combat, but imposed greater weight. The immortals' strengths were discipline, organization, stable numbers, archery, mobility, dependable command, logistical support, and their position near the king. They could serve as elite infantry, a reserve, a royal guard, or a force for demanding missions. Their weaknesses appeared when terrain removed freedom of movement. They were not heavy infantry designed for prolonged pushing contests against a hoplite phalanx. Shorter spears, lighter shields, and narrow ground placed them at a disadvantage, and they remained most effective when supported by cavalry, archers, engineers, and other imperial contingents. The immortals were elite, but elite did not mean invincible. Their effectiveness depended on mission, terrain, and the military system around them. At Thermopylae, they struggled when forced directly against the Greek line. On the mountain path above the pass, the same discipline and mobility would make them decisive. After the failure of Darius's earlier invasion, Xerxes prepared a campaign on a far larger scale. Its aims included punishing Athens and Eretria, asserting royal authority, bringing more Greek cities into the Achaemenid system, and completing a war his predecessor had left unfinished. Troops, ships, animals, engineers, and supplies were gathered from across the empire. Among the most prominent Persian infantry were the 10,000 soldiers Herodotus calls the Immortals, positioned close to the king and his royal entourage. The army moved west through Anatolia toward the Hellespont, the narrow waterway separating Asia from Europe. Xerxes ordered pontoon bridges constructed so the land forces could cross without relying entirely on ships. The passage required strict control. Units had to move in sequence, baggage animals had to be kept from blocking the route, and officers had to prevent confusion among contingents speaking different languages. The Immortals were more than battlefield troops during this movement. Their position near Xerxes allowed them to protect the royal column, maintain order around the king, and react quickly if a disturbance threatened the march. Their visibility also served a political purpose. As the army passed through imperial territory, the elite corps displayed the wealth, discipline, and authority of the monarchy to subjects and local rulers. For the elite corps, the long march also tested endurance before battle. Soldiers had to preserve equipment, remain near the royal column, and stay prepared for sudden orders despite dust, heat, delays, and repeated changes of terrain. Herodotus gives enormous figures for the size of Xerxes' army and the people accompanying it. Modern historians generally treat those totals with caution. A force numbering in the millions would have faced almost impossible problems of water, food, road space, sanitation, and speed. Even a much smaller army would have been significantly larger than the Greek defenders later assembled at Thermopylae. The important point is not an exact total, but the extraordinary scale of the imperial mobilization. After crossing into Europe, the army advanced through Thrace and Macedonia. Supply depots had been prepared in advance, ships supported the movement along the coast, and communities on the route were required to provide food and other resources. Some local powers submitted, while others contributed troops or symbols of loyalty. The campaign demonstrated the organizational reach of the Achaemenid state. Yet the same system also contained vulnerabilities. The land army depended heavily on coastal supply and communication. Every day of movement increased the need for grain, water, fodder, transport, and coordination. If the fleet suffered serious losses or the supply network broke down, the enormous army would become harder to sustain. Imperial scale created strength, but it also created dependence. When the Persians reached Thermopylae, geography became the central problem. The pass lay between steep mountains and the ancient shoreline. It narrowed the front so severely that only a limited number of soldiers could engage at once. Cavalry had almost no room to maneuver. Archers could apply pressure, but could not easily surround the defenders. Troops waiting behind the front had little influence on the immediate struggle. This battlefield neutralized many advantages of Xerxes' army. The Immortals were trained to operate within a flexible imperial system supported by missile troops, cavalry, and movement across open ground. At Thermopylae, they were forced into a confined frontal contest against Greek hoplites using large shields and longer spears. Their numbers could not be fully committed, and their mobility had little value. The direct attack failed, but Hydarnes retained command of the corps. Then Ephialtes revealed a mountain route that passed behind the Greek position. Xerxes needed soldiers capable of moving at night through difficult terrain, maintaining formation, overcoming or bypassing guards, and arriving behind the defenders before the opportunity disappeared. The mission suited Hydarnes and his men better than another assault into the pass. It required discipline rather than mass, speed rather than pressure, and secrecy rather than display. The Immortals would leave the main battlefield, follow a local guide into the mountains, and attempt to transform the entire tactical situation. They had failed to break the Greek wall from the front. Now they would try to make that wall irrelevant by appearing where it could no longer protect Leonidas. The Immortals entered Thermopylae with a reputation greater than any Persian unit in Xerxes' army. Yet reputation could not remove the disadvantages before them. The pass reduced the battlefield to a narrow corridor, where only a fraction of the force could fight at once. Soldiers waiting behind the front could not easily add pressure, while casualties at the leading edge slowed every fresh assault. The terrain also weakened the Persian system of battle. In open country, Persian infantry could combine archery, movement, cavalry support, and attacks from several directions. At Thermopylae, cavalry had little room to operate. Archers could maintain pressure, but they could not surround the Greek line. The Immortals were forced into a direct collision with heavy hoplites holding a prepared position. Their equipment was not useless, but it suited another style. Persian spears were shorter than Greek thrusting spears. Woven shields were lighter and easier to move, but they provided less mass during a close contest between dense infantry lines. Before a Persian soldier could reach the Greek shield wall, he had to pass the longer spear points extending from it. Herodotus says the Immortals achieved no more than the median troops who attacked before them. This does not prove they were false elites or poor soldiers. Elite formations can fail when sent into unfavorable ground, denied supporting arms, and required to repeat the same frontal method against a prepared enemy. The Greek defenders fought as part of a larger coalition, not as isolated superhuman warriors. Leonidas commanded several thousand troops initially, and the Spartans benefited from the wall, the confined pass, rotating units, and allied support. A balanced account should avoid turning Persian failure into humiliation or Greek success into fantasy. After repeated attacks failed, the situation changed through information rather than brute force. A local man named Ephialtes informed Xerxes of a mountain path that crossed the heights and emerged behind the Greek position. The route is called the Anapeia Path. Leonidas knew such a route existed, and had placed Phocian soldiers on the higher ground to guard against encirclement. The mountain defense lacked the advantages of the main pass. It covered wider and more difficult terrain, had no comparable wall, and was harder to observe in darkness. The Phocians had to detect movement early enough to block a force advancing through trees and slopes. A determined enemy might also bypass them instead of stopping for a full battle. Hydarnes was ordered to lead the selected Persian force along the path. Guided by Ephialtes, his soldiers began the march during the night. This was not another massed assault. It required controlled movement, silence, endurance, and confidence in a local guide. Weapons and equipment had to be carried through narrow mountain tracks without allowing the formation to disintegrate. The men could not use bright light freely without revealing their position. Trees and uneven ground restricted visibility. Officers had to maintain contact between groups, prevent soldiers from losing the path, and keep the column moving quickly enough to reach the rear of Thermopylae before the Greeks escaped. Here, elite discipline became more important than heavy armor. According to Herodotus, the Phocians detected the approaching Persians through the sound of movement and leaves underfoot. Surprised before they could establish a complete defense, they withdrew toward higher ground and prepared to resist. Hydarnes briefly feared the force ahead might be Spartan, but Ephialtes identified them as Phocians. Hydarnes then made the crucial decision not to stop and destroy them. His mission was not to conquer the mountain or punish every defender. He needed to reach the rear of Leonidas before the opportunity disappeared. Bypassing their position allowed the column to continue toward the pass. News of the encirclement reached Leonidas through scouts, deserters, or both. Most Greek contingents then withdrew or were permitted to leave. The exact decision remains debated, but the final defenders included the 300 Spartans, about 700 Thespians, and a Theban contingent whose circumstances remain disputed. Servants, helots, and other attendants were probably still present. The Immortals therefore did not descend behind only 300 men. They entered the final phase of a battle involving several Greek and Persian forces. At the front, Xerxes' army renewed its pressure. From the rear, Hydarnes' column closed the escape route and destroyed the defensive value of the pass. The remaining Greeks could no longer face in one direction, preserve a secure retreat, or rely on the narrow ground to protect both flanks. Leonidas was killed, weapons broke, and the defenders were gradually overwhelmed as the space around them contracted. The Immortals did not single-handedly destroy the final defense. Their decisive achievement was operational. They had failed to break the Greek wall through direct force, but their disciplined march made the wall irrelevant. Thermopylae was a Persian military victory. Xerxes gained the road into central Greece and continued toward Athens. The Greeks created a lasting legend of sacrifice, but they did not hold the pass. The Immortals' importance lay not in winning the frontal contest. It lay in appearing where the defenders could no longer continue one. After Thermopylae fell, Xerxes' army advanced into central Greece. Athens was evacuated, occupied, and burned, while the Persian fleet continued operating along the coast. The campaign increasingly depended on control of the sea, secure supply routes, and cooperation between land and naval forces. The Immortals remained associated with the royal army, but the surviving sources do not allow us to reconstruct every task they performed after the pass was opened. Their silence in later accounts should not be mistaken for disappearance. It reflects the fragmentary nature of evidence and the narrow interests of surviving Greek narratives. The greatest uncertainty concerns what happened after the Persian defeat at Salamis. Xerxes withdrew much of his force toward Asia and left Mardonius to continue the campaign in Greece. Herodotus states that Mardonius selected the Immortals for his remaining army, except for Hydarnes, who did not wish to leave the king. That account is important, but it is not completely secure. Some modern interpretations suggest that the corps may have returned to Asia with Xerxes and Hydarnes because its connection to the king was central to its identity. The evidence therefore does not justify a confident claim that all 10,000 Immortals fought at Plataea in 479 BC. The safest conclusion is that the ancient narrative and modern reconstruction do not fully agree. Another source of confusion is the number 10,000 itself. Greek authors sometimes mention other forces of that size in different periods and campaigns. Not every unit numbering 10,000 should automatically be identified as the Immortals. A large formation might lack the special replacement system, royal connection, elite status, and association with Hydarnes described by Herodotus. Modern entertainment has changed their image even more dramatically. Films, comics, and games often portray the Immortals wearing metal masks. dressed entirely in black, and fighting like inhuman assassins. Some versions even give them monstrous faces or supernatural abilities. There is no reliable historical evidence for that appearance. Ancient accounts instead describe elite Persian infantry carrying bows, spears, shields, swords, or daggers, and wearing Persian clothing. Their distinction came from selection, organization, status, gold ornament, logistical support, and proximity to the king, not from masks or secret powers. The Immortals remain famous because their name is unforgettable. Their reported strength was fixed at 10,000, and their role at Thermopylae placed them opposite the most famous Spartan legend. There is also a powerful historical irony. Nearly everything commonly repeated about Persia's elite corps comes from Herodotus, a Greek author writing about the enemies of the Greek world. This means every reconstruction must separate ancient testimony from certainty. The corps was real enough in Herodotus's narrative, but its Persian name, precise recruitment, exact equipment, and later movements remain partly unresolved. The Persian immortals were not supernatural warriors, and they were not the masked monsters of modern cinema. They were an elite Persian corps whose strength came from organization, continuity, mobility, and their position close to Xerxes. At Thermopylae, the narrow pass denied them the advantages of numbers and flexible warfare. They could not break the Greek line through repeated frontal attacks. Yet under Hydarnes, they crossed the mountain path, bypassed the defenders above the pass, and appeared behind Leonidas. They did not destroy the Greek wall by striking it harder. They made the wall irrelevant.